Good afternoon. I am Ernesto Zedillo of the Center for the Study of Globalization. Thanks for being here. Well, exactly 2 years ago, on September 15, 2008, at 1:30 in the morning, it was announced that Lehman Brothers was going out of business. And that was the beginning of a very special period, an episode, because we started, I would say you can mark with that date, what is now called the first grand crisis of the 21st century. I don't think I need to make a recollection of the events that follow the fall of Lehman Brothers, but it's interesting to remember that only 2 days after that, AIG went under the water, a money market fund went also under the water, and by Thursday and Friday of that week, there was literally widespread panic in not only financial markets in the US, but practically all over the world. So much that on Friday of that week, the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank, of the Board of the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States, went to the White House and got authorization from the President of the United States to undertake unprecedented efforts to avoid the collapse of the financial sector. It still took a few weeks before they got their way with the US Congress. And during those hectic days, I think it is not an exaggeration to say that we were on the eve of seeing a total collapse, not only of the financial system, but perhaps of the real economy, of the major economies of the world. It took a few weeks before we could see some coherent and coordinated action to stop or to mitigate that huge risk of collapse. But by then, I think the damage was done to a significant extent. The global economy had its worst year in terms of GDP growth in many decades, in 60 years. There was a lot of variance, but practically every major economy suffered a lot. And also a number of emerging economies had to take substantial pain. Right from the beginning, needless to say, the occurrence of this crisis was identified with failures in the financial system. It was particularly revealing that right from the first meeting of the G20 at the leaders level in November of 2008, those leaders committed strongly to undertake coordinated action in order to provide the world with a new financial architecture and new financial rules that will make the system less vulnerable to the kind of events that we were going through those days. They reiterated that commitment at the London meeting of April '09 and certainly in September of '09 at their summit in Pittsburgh. And meanwhile, on the national tracks, various efforts of reform were started. At some points, these efforts have not been necessarily consistent among themselves, despite the commitment taken by the G20, but in any case, it has been happening. Needless to say, the most significant of these undertakings, given the relative importance of the US financial system, is precisely the reform that was signed into bill only last July, after a long, tortuous, complex process of negotiation in the US Congress. For some people, well, this is the reform that not only will set a standard for other parts of the world, but that perhaps also will prevent the occurrence of another crisis like the one we had in 2008 and that to some extent we are still suffering today. But for others, there may be questions about the usefulness, the consistency, the substance of that reform. Some people may even question whether it was of the highest priority to have a financial reform like the one that is being posed, considering that perhaps it was not so much a problem in the financial sector as a problem in the management of what we economists like to call the global macroeconomic imbalances, believing that without those global macroeconomic imbalances, perhaps we wouldn't have seen those problems in the financial sector to begin with. But this is just to say that the subject continues to be highly controversial. It will continue to be debated, but for the time being, I think it is important to pay attention to what policymakers are deciding nowadays. And for that reason, today we have put together what I dare to call a fantastic panel of experts to discuss the financial reform in the United States. I can hardly think of a better group to undertake this endeavor, because we have with us, of course, our very own Professor Bob Shiller. And when people speak about this crisis, I think there are less than 3 experts that can be pointed out as persons that saw it coming somehow. And one of them, of course, was Professor Bob Shiller, and I don't need to go through his very long biography because all of us know about his very important work. We also have with us, and I thank him a lot for making the journey, the long journey from New York City, Professor Tom Cooley, who until recently was Dean of the Stern School of Business at NYU, but more importantly for our purposes, he has been an intellectual leader at the Stern School of a group that in a very lucid and timely fashion has been following events, of course, before the crisis, but particularly relevant during the crisis and after the crisis. This group at NYU, with an incredibly opportunity, produced a major work which is titled Restoring Financial Stability, How to Repair a Failed System. I think they got together in the fall of 2008, and already early in 2009 they had produced this incredible volume. And even more surprising is that a few weeks after the signing of the bill, the financial reform bill, they had produced another book which It's already available somehow, but it will be published in print within a few days, which is called Regulating Wall Street, the New Architecture of Global Finance, which also has a fantastic collection of papers. So Tom Cooley is with us today. And then, with us, we have one of our newest acquisitions. We have Steve Roach, who hardly needs any introduction because he has been a very visible economic influential analyst for a long time. He used to be chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia. He just retired, and with very good judgment, he decided to accept appointments both at the School of Management here and also at the soon-to-be presented Jackson Institute. And the reason why I thought it was great to have Steve here is because he was also among the very few who saw it coming. I remember to have been with Steve in places, strange places like Moscow, Beijing, Barcelona, before the crisis, many places. And Steve was always speaking about the crisis to come, you know. And I remember that people sometimes say, what is this guy talking about? What crisis he's talking about? Well, unfortunately, Steve was right. So I think he's very fortunate that now he is part of our community, and probably this is one of the first public appearances that Steve does at our university. So having said that, let's go to the real work, and I will ask Bob Shiller to open our session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ernesto. So we're talking about the new Dodd-Frank bill. I also want to add the new Basel III agreement that just came out. There's a lot of information. This is a major turning point in our financial system. Let me first say that I'm much more warm and positive to Dodd and Frank than most of my economist colleagues. I think it's amazing what they did, given what their background was. They're not PhD economists. I think we would have had a better bill if we put John Giannakopoulos, Gary Gorton, and members of this panel on writing the bill. Barney Frank was a dropout from a poli-sci PhD program. He's pretty smart, though. If you look at the bills, they take account of the problems, take account of the issues. It seems like they've listened to a lot of people. But I don't think that Congress can resolve the difficult questions. So unfortunately, the Dodd-Frank bill seems to be very strong on setting up new agencies and ordering the agencies to study something and then decide. And it seems to me that the outcome of this will be depends on what those people do. And we don't know yet. I think that most of it is to come. But I do want to congratulate Dodd and Frank. I think they did well. We don't have a dysfunctional Congress, at least in terms of this bill. So Ernesto points out today is the second anniversary of the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy. I wanted to do a thought experiment and ask what would have happened regarding this bankruptcy if Dodd-Frank had been put in place, and let's say a full 10 years ago, so it could have all worked out. Now, I have to say I don't know what exactly would have happened because Dodd-Frank, as I said, is a plan for future studies and the like, but I'm going to try to imagine. So the Dodd-Frank bill creates something called the Financial Services Oversight Council, which is supposed to be preventing systemic failures, or making recommendations to government regulators to prevent crises. And it's going to be headed by the Treasury Secretary. Now, this sounds like it is potentially a big and important change, but I do have some little questions about it. I kind of remember back in 1987, President Reagan set up something called the President's Working Group on Financial Markets, and it became nicknamed the Plunge Team, and they were supposed to prevent systemic crises. And it had the Treasury Secretary, I forget who else. It's kind of a similar event. They didn't do much, I guess, and they didn't prevent this crisis. So let's go back to 2000. The Treasury Secretary was Larry Summers. Okay, he is famous for, at a Jackson Hole conference, chastising Raghu Rajan for claiming that there's instability in the economy. And so I kind of doubt that Larry Summers was in the mood to do the kinds of things that FSOC is supposed to do. But I wanted to go on with other Treasury Secretaries. Who is the next Treasury Secretary? Do you remember? Paul O'Neill, who was former CEO of Alcoa, the aluminum producing company. By the way, not, as far as I know, an econ PhD. And he was replaced under Bush by John Snow, who was the CEO of CSX, a railroad. Okay, these are the guys who are supposed to be doing these steps to prevent this crisis. And then we got Henry Paulson, who knew a little bit more about finance, apparently. But this is what is supposed to happen. The FSOC is supposed to remember that the Lehman Brothers is not a bank. It owned a bank called Lehman Brothers Bank, but it was tiny. It was only $5 billion. That bank, by the way, still survives. They got spun off from the owner that died, and the bank, guess what they did? The first thing they did is to change their name. They're called the Aurora Bank now, but they're okay. But Lehman Brothers was not a bank, so it didn't have bank regulation, and it didn't have the Fed regulating it. Now, this is the critical thing in Dodd-Frank. Lehman Brothers was an investment bank, which is not a commercial bank. So Dodd-Frank says that the FSOC can, on a 2/3 vote, designate it to be regulated by the Fed, but only if the council determines, and I'm reading from the bill, from the act, if the council determines that material financial distress of the U.S. non-bank financial company could pose a threat to the financial stability of the United States. Okay? So 10 years ago, would this have happened, or any time in the last decade, would the Treasury Secretary have announced that Lehman Brothers poses a threat to the financial stability of the United States and so should be regulated by the Federal Reserve? I want to point out that Lehman's debt was rated A+ by Standard & Poor's until June of 2008, which was like a few months before their bankruptcy. Now, so what will happen? Will the FSOC in order to make this work, they've got to put a lot of companies like Lehman Brothers that look perfectly sound under the direction of the FSOC. I could go on and on. I'm running. We're talking about a 1,000-page bill, and there's so much going on that I can't. I think that it all depends on who we put in charge of the FSOC and how aggressive they are and how much they understand what's going on. Now, John Akopoulos, who's sitting right in front of me, has made a very convincing case that there is a sort of leverage cycle that drives economies. So we get, and this has been backed up by other, so for example, Reinhardt and Rogoff have shown that leverage builds up and booms, and then it tends to collapse, and it produces bad periods that go up for a long time. So what's in the bill regarding this? Well, I see in the act, it's now an act, it says, I have it here somewhere, but I'm taking too much time to find it, that it's essentially the language is something like, if the Fed, now regulating Lehman Brothers or someone like that, determines that the company is a grave threat to the U.S. economy, it can impose a 15-to-1 leverage ratio, something like that. I'm trying to find it here. And will they do that? I don't know. That's the question. Basel III is interposing as well. That's an international agreement that also talks a lot about leverage. And there's so many ideas here. I don't know where to. Let me just jump ahead because I don't want to monopolize this whole thing. Just concluding from what I've said, that I give credit to Dodd and Frank and all the other people for taking note of. I think they've listened to you, John, and they've listened to Gary Gorton, and they don't know what to make of it. So they said, these people are smart and they might be right, so let's commission a study. They created the Office of Financial Research. Now I was wondering, that's under the FSOC. That could be a big thing. If they fund it at a high enough level, you know, we could have 10,000 economists there researching financial stability. So I looked at it, does it say how big it'll be? And maybe I missed something, but it says something like the Treasury Secretary shall confer with someone and they'll decide on a budget. So we don't know. The Office of Financial Research could turn out to be John Akopoulos and 1,000 MBAs working under him, or it could be me and 2 MBAs, or who knows what. We just don't know. And, but the bill is
Do you want the job?
That would be an important job. But anyway, let me other say, it would be hard to turn that down, I suppose. I mentioned that the credit rating given to Lehman Brothers was A+. Something was wrong there. Okay, well the bill has a whole section on credit rating agencies, and it has all kinds of ideas how to prevent this from making headway. But I read the whole thing, and I haven't read it maybe as sympathetically as I could, but it has things in it like there's a title saying information from sources other than the issuer. Basically, the credit rating agency is required by law now not to rely entirely on the issuer. There's a lot of little things like that are in the bills that might. I'm just going to mention a few because I think I'm out of time here, but just a couple other things. Executive compensation. This is a political hot potato, and part of the problem is that our system of executive compensation may reward inappropriate risk-taking. So you think now let's say I'm CEO of Lehman or some company like that. Everybody knows the government's going to bail me out. So hey, I can borrow at the riskless rate. So why don't I borrow at the riskless rate and leverage myself up in risky assets, and at 50-50 chance of I'll make it and I'll be rich, or I go bankrupt and then, you know, nothing happens to me. So we want to sort of consider some kind of change in compensation structure that might change their incentive to take these risks. And there's a whole bunch of things in this bill. There is something about preventing incentive-based payment arrangements that it doesn't say just for the Fed. It says that appropriate federal regulators can prohibit pay arrangements that create the wrong incentives. So actually, I wrote a New York Times column advocating something that I belong to a group called the Squam Lake Group. And we had many recommendations, but one of our recommendations, and I know Tom Cooley has recommendations on executive compensation that are kind of similar in a way, but our recommendation is that executives at systemically important firms should have part of their salary held back. This should be a law. You can't take all your salary up front. And you'll only get it like 5 years later, and you won't get it if the government bailed you out. So it creates a penalty for being bailed out. So I wrote a New York Times column about that, and then to my amazement, Barney Frank called me 2 days later. He's just on the phone. He just calls me up. You know, he's not very ceremonious. There's no secretary. He just calls me up, and he said, I liked your column. And he said, I think it's in our bill already. And he said, well, I think it's there, but I don't want to change the wording now because it's too late. But I found the passage that he was referring to, and it just says that regulators can prohibit incentive-based payments. And now Barney has invited someone from our group to a hearing on this. So it seems like we do have a functional Congress. They have ideas. They're listening to academics, but they're still groping. And maybe the other thing, there's a huge section in the bill about mortgage reform. And there's also a Consumer Financial Products Safety Commission. And, I think it's a good bill, but I think I'll stop with this and I'll say that it's only good to the extent that we make it good. And it seems to me that it has enough in it that if we get the right people and we respect people who've studied and thought about these things, they can transform the Dodd-Frank bill into something that really does help prevent this kind of crisis.
Thank you both. Professor Cooley.
Well, thank you very much. I want to second one of Bob's recommendations that write to your congressman and nominate John Giannakopoulos to be the head of the Office of Financial Research, and the end result of this bill will be a lot better than you might now expect. I want to also start with a little shameless advertising. There's a forthcoming book called Regulating Wall Street by myself and 40 of my closest friends. It's in stores soon by, I think, October 12th, something like that. You can order it now on Amazon, and it explains all 2,300 plus pages of the Dodd-Frank Act in simple, easy to understand terms. Just kidding. I mean, I've read all 2,300 pages of the Act, and I understand quite a few of them. So, but as Bob said, there's a lot still to be determined in the way the Act is implemented. So there's an enormous amount of rulemaking yet to be done. There, I believe, something like 112 rules that are yet to be written. There are 60 studies that have to be completed before we know how exactly this is going to change the landscape of regulation. Now, the Dodd-Frank Act is widely described as the most ambitious attempt to change financial regulation of the financial system since the 1930s. And I agree with that assessment. It's the most ambitious. The question is, does it have a chance at being as successful as reforms that were put in place in the 1930s? The 1930s was sort of a watershed in U.S. economic history and a watershed in regulatory history. And for whatever reason, by accident, by design, by just good luck, the reforms that were put in place in the 1930s gave us, one could easily argue, 7 decades of relatively good financial performance. Our economy, our financial system was the envy of the world. And so did that happen because these were well-designed regulations, or did it happen simply because we were in the sweet spot in terms of economic growth following World War II? There are a lot of possible explanations for that. And so one thing you can do is you can ask the question, what made those reforms successful? And you can go back to the simple economic theory of regulation and ask, why did these things succeed? They succeeded because they identified externalities in the financial system, asymmetric information problems, moral hazard problems, and they addressed them with regulations that specifically targeted those failures of the financial system. So the famous Glass-Steagall Act was one such thing, the creation of the FDIC, the creation of the SEC. All of these targeted specific market failures in the financial system. And as a result, and then they addressed the likely feedback of the regulations on things like moral hazard and so on by putting in place further constraints on financial activities. So the question is, over time, what happened? Well, over time, what happened is that the world evolved, financial markets evolved, banks began to eat away at the edges of these regulation. The process of regulatory arbitrage began to render the regulations ineffective, and attempts to patch up the system by, say, the Basel I and Basel II capital accords were disaster because the banks very quickly used those rules as opportunities for regulatory arbitrage. And what happened is, what grew out of that is a parallel financial intermediation system, the shadow banking system. And the shadow banking system was not subject to the rules of the game in the same way that deposit-based banking systems had been. And without taking you through the whole litany of the financial crisis and the stories that led up to September 15th, 2008, you can easily recall what it was that happened and why things got out of control. So with that as a preamble, what do I think of the Dodd-Frank Act? Well, the real story, to answer that question, you have to begin with an analysis of what caused the failure, what caused the collapse. And there were, in my view, according to me and my co-authors, it was a result of the buildup of systemic risk in the financial system. That is, risk in which individual firms' actions had consequences for the whole financial commons. And there was also kind of an undermining of the regulatory system that had been put in place to deal with that. And there was a growth of this parallel banking system. So I don't want to take up too much time. I'll be relatively brief. But what do I think of the Dodd-Frank Act? Well, I think I agree with Bob. I think it's an amazing thing that this complicated act got through the enormously difficult political process, and that Barney Frank and Christopher Dodd managed to keep their ducks in a row and muster sufficient support to get this thing passed. There's a lot to be still determined. What I will say about it is that, in some sense, its heart is in the right place. That is, it recognizes the central importance of systemic risk to the financial system. And it tries to address that by the aforementioned Systemic Risk Council that's going to deal with systemically important institutions, by giving the Federal Reserve new powers to address systemically risky institutions and to regulate them, and by providing for things like orderly liquidation of systemically important institutions, by requiring them to prepare funeral plans so that they can engage in an orderly demise, if you like. And so it tries to put back in place a lot of things that were effective in the 1930s at containing these kinds of risks. It has a lot of pieces to it that are essentially irrelevant to the smooth functioning of the financial system. I would argue that the things, we can get into the details of why I think this, but issues of executive compensation and consumer protection, a lot of that stuff is not really central to the stability of the financial system. So it goes a long way towards making the system safer. It has sections on capital requirements, which say that whatever comes out of the Basel process, the U.S. is going to stick to strict capital and liquidity requirements. It has a very good section on regulating derivatives contracts, which ensures a greater deal of transparency and more easy resolution of derivative positions in the event of financial collapse and so on. So what don't I like about it? If its heart is in the right place. Well, one is that it basically fails to ask the question that you should ask at the beginning, which is, what is banking and what is a bank? It's designed to regulate by form rather than function. So there's far too much of an emphasis on deposit-based banking institutions without a recognition, without enough of a recognition. There's some recognition that a lot of the problems that caused this financial crisis came from the fact that the shadow banking system evolved in parallel to the deposit-based banking system. And a lot of the instability and a lot of the problems arose there. There are problems in the repo markets, and there are many issues that are just simply not addressed. Now, it does say that the Fed has the ability to designate systemically risky institutions that are not banks, that are not deposit-based banks. But at the same time, it severely limits what is called the Fed's 13.3 lending authority, which is what it appealed to when it bailed out Bear Stearns, would have had to appeal to had it bailed out Lehman Brothers. So what it says is that the Fed can designate systemically risky non-bank firms. It can appeal to this Systemic Risk Council, and I was sobered by Bob's account of some of our recent Treasury secretaries, thinking about them dealing with it. Evidently, Paul O'Neill was most concerned at the Treasury with the boxes that were piled in the hallway, because he was a big worker safety nut. And I remember actually him saying to me at some point, why does it take us so damn long to close the books? At Alcoa, we used to close the books within,
The first
anyway.
company that reports in the quarter.
Yeah. So that's a sobering prospect, right? You don't want to be waiting for for something like that, for him to conduct a worker safety inspection while Bear Stearns is melting down. So it's excessively focused on institutions and not the financial commons. It talks about systemic risk, it talks about orderly liquidation plans and so on, but it's firm by firm, bank by bank, no recognition of the systemic. There is a recognition of systemic risk, but there's nothing in the bill that would discourage firms from creating this kind of risk. So if you're an economist, immediately when you think of an externality that firms like that are creating by their actions, the immediate tool for resolving that comes to mind are what we call Peruvian taxes. That is, tax them for engaging in this activity that's creating risks or imposing costs on people who are firms that are not parties to their transactions, and thereby discourage those kinds of activities. The other, and that's just completely missing. The end result of the great debate about what was called the bank tax was that the cost to society of resolving a systemically important firm that goes bust are to be borne by the surviving firms rather than borne ex ante by all the firms. Now that's like, charging the neighbors for the fire department and the cost of fighting the fire in your house, when you're barbecuing in the living room. This makes no sense. and it imposes costs on surviving institutions at exactly the time that they're likely to be weakest and most vulnerable. So these are some of the serious defects of the act. I mean, I think it has the possibility to make the world a little bit safer, but it has some serious flaws in its thinking about these important issues. And now the important exercise is, I think, the one that Bob was talking about. That is, you think about if this act had been in place in 2000 or 2003, what would have happened as the financial crisis began to unfold? Would it have stopped or mitigated the crisis? The answer is, by and large, I think, no. Might have mitigated a bit. Bear Stearns would not have been eligible for lending by the Fed because Bear Stearns was not a bank. Once again, it's regulation by form rather than function. Lehman Brothers would not have been eligible. Now, what the new act does say is that they could appeal to Treasury Secretary, think Paul O'Neill. They could designate an entire industry at risk and provide lending facilities that apply to the whole industry. So things that they did to rescue money market funds would be perfectly valid under the Dodd-Frank Act. And so there is a mechanism in place that would have stopped runs on some money market funds, I think. But it would not have stopped the run on Bear Stearns. It would not have stopped the run on Lehman Brothers. And the outcome eventually would have been, if this act had been in place, the financial crisis would have gotten more severe earlier than waiting for the Lehman collapse. It would have started with Bear Stearns. That's my take. And then a final criticism, a final thing to at least think about the act is this. One of the most important, two of the most important institutions in the shadow banking system, the most systemically important institutions, one of the generators of huge risk in the economy that are still costing us money to bail them out, were Fannie and Freddie. And the act says absolutely nothing about them. It has nothing to say about what to do about housing. Now, we've been promised an answer about what we're going to do about those soon, but it remains to be seen. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tom. Turn, Steve.
Ernesto, before I offer my brief remarks, in the interest of full disclosure, contrary to rumors, I have not retired from Morgan Stanley. I'm still working at Morgan Stanley. I'm there a couple days a week, 3 days a week at Yale. Maybe one day I'll retire from Morgan Stanley.
But they pay you less now. or what?
We'll find that out shortly. So, it's important for me to tell you that because, you can evaluate my perspective on the basis of the seat or the seats that I inhabit as well. Although, as Ernesto did say, I've not been bashful about offering some critical remarks of markets and market participants in my long career. I do remember this date 2 years ago. Actually, if I go back to a couple of days before that, on Friday, I think September the 12th, our stock at Morgan Stanley closed at $45 a share, and it was down a lot from the highs in the low 70s earlier that summer, and we were feeling pretty depressed. And then 48 hours later, it hit an intraday low of 6, and it's now bounced all the way back to 27. So, 2 years later, I don't think shareholders of financial services firms are feeling particularly warm and fuzzy about the post-crisis climate. I like the exercise that Bob took us through. I think it's very helpful. I think the real question, I would put it somewhat differently, though, and that is, will this type of legislation prevent the next crisis? That's what it's supposedly all about. I think it's important to go back and do the experiment to see how it would have done this time. But I think what we're really after is getting a mechanism in place that would certainly not allow something like this to happen again in the future. And as somebody who's lived through a lot of financial crises as a Wall Street participant in my 30-plus years in the business, and having participated in a number of post-crisis, post-mortem rule-writing exercises, the one thing that I always draw from these exercises, and Dodd-Frank is a case in point, is that we always come up with rules and regulations that are highly conditioned by the crisis we've just gone through, and yet it's human nature, and Bob and his great work on behavioral finance and animal spirits can tell you better than anyone that the next crisis is never like the last one. And so, we may have done a terrific job, and it's not clear to me we have, but just grant the possibility that we did a terrific job in preventing the next subprime crisis. The odds of having another subprime crisis are probably not very high at this point in time. I also find it interesting that the same Congress that was able to get this agreement signed into law under enormous pressure from the White House is also the same Congress that empowered something called the FCIC, the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, that is due to report, I believe, in December of this year on what actually caused the crisis. So maybe it's ironic or perhaps foolish for the same legislative authority to have offered up a bill that's designed to fix the crisis that they don't know what caused it. It's to me, I agree with Bob. It was an amazing political undertaking, but it smacks an awful lot of high-powered political theater in an important election year. And again, just to echo the point that Bob and Tom have both made, and that is, it's premature to judge whether or not this bill is going to work effectively, since so much of it is yet to be determined. It's a framework, and far be it from me to prejudge the ultimate framework. What I would like to just offer in my one a comment that I would like to leave you with this afternoon, and that is, even if this were the perfect mousetrap, I would argue that regulatory reform is a necessary but not sufficient condition to prevent the next crisis from occurring. The missing leg to the stool, in my opinion, is the failure of our legislative authorities to address the horrific flaws in the conduct of monetary policy in the United States. We have had a bubble-prone central bank in the United States really since the mid to late 1990s, and I can assure you it's not getting any better today. We have a central bank chairman, and I don't mean to make this personal, but you have to sort of talk about the man, his body of research, and the papers that he's presented, in Ben Bernanke, who simply does not believe that monetary policy should be used in any way whatsoever to address asset bubbles and the way in which they distort and ultimately can infect the real side of the U.S. economy. He did research on this prior to coming into the Fed. He's written papers on it, speeches on it, and he had a major influence on his predecessor, who certainly believed very much in the same thing. My view, and I, for those of you who read some of the things that I've written over the years, I sound like a broken record, but I'll just run the risk of breaking the record one more time. I think monetary policy in the U.S. has been far too accommodative for far too long. The real federal funds rate, the nominal funds rate adjusted for inflation, has been below its long-term average, I think, for about 9 of the past 10 years. It's been negative or below zero, where it is right now, for more than half that time. This is the most accommodative monetary policy that the U.S. Federal Reserve has run since the mid-1970s. And for those of you who remember the 70s, that was not a particularly a good period of time. The U.S. Central Bank has had a view for a long time that monetary policy is a blunt instrument, should not be used to lean against asset bubbles, because after all, no one ever really knows if there's an asset bubble, and it takes too big a toll on the broad economy to use a blunt instrument, even if you did know what an asset bubble is. I honestly think that's self-serving gobbledygook. The idea that we didn't know that there was a bubble in equities or property or credit. I mean, I realize there were probably a few people in America who didn't read one of your books, Bob, but it was pretty widely distributed, and you were very prominent in warning of these series of bubbles well ahead of time, but you were not alone. There were others, and there was a debate on this, but it was pretty clear at the end of the 1990s, as well as the end of the property bubble, or if you're looking at credit spreads, that something was seriously awry in the conduct of monetary policy that was providing the type of liquidity that was fueling these bubbles. The Fed says in response, well, if we had leaned against these bubbles, we would have taken a toll on a larger portion of the economy than we would have liked. What is, I think, particularly striking was at their peaks in sort of the 2006 to 2007 period, the two bubble-affected sectors of the United States economy, home building activity and bubble-distorted personal consumption activity, collectively added up to 77% of the U.S. GDP. I mean, this is what you have a blunt instrument to address. You had nearly 80% of the economy distorted by bubbles that were fueled by irresponsibly accommodative monetary policy. So I think we need to fix that, and I think we need to add financial stability to as another dimension of the Fed's policy mandate. And I think the Fed should be held explicitly accountable towards setting monetary policy, not just with respect to full employment, as it was empowered to do in the Employment Act of 1946, not as it was then amended to aim for price stability, as it was required to do in the Humphrey Hawkins Act of 1978 after the Great Inflation. But now, in the aftermath of the Great Crisis and Recession, I think it's equally important to add financial stability to the Fed's policy mandate. The Fed says, oh, don't worry, we've learned the lesson, trust us. We would never do this again. With all due respect, and as somebody who has great personal fondness for an institution that gave me my first job at a grad school, I don't trust the Fed in this regard. I think they need to be held explicitly accountable for financial stability as well. And I think as part of that, they need, like other central banks, they don't like doing this. This is a tough thing for the staff to do. They need to as part of their accountability and financial stability, produce their own financial stability report on a regular basis, so that they're very transparent in the way they understand the linkage between monetary policy and financial stability. We need to hardwire this requirement into the system. I think that's the main point that I wanted to make, Ernesto. I just would finish with a couple of other little caveats. I think your point on global imbalances that you mentioned at the outset is very important. You know, this is one of these lofty, highbrow discussions that takes place in G20 circles. You know, if you think that, you know, that Paul O'Neill and John Snow were out of their element in discussing systemic risk, you ought to sit in on one of these G20 meetings and listen to them talk about global imbalances. So I think we need, you know, probably greater expertise in understanding this very destabilizing mix of global savings right now and the role that has played in fostering this crisis. And then let me just wade into something that I'm probably going to regret even speaking about, given where I have worked and where I'm still working part-time, and in light of what has previously been said. And this is on the executive compensation issue. I realize this is a very inflammatory issue. It's a very sort of high-charged populist issue, especially in election year. And there's a perception that these, you know, rich Wall Street guys have been ripping off the little guy for a long time. And you know, I well remember I was working in Asia, and my wife sent me she forwarded to me an email flyer that she had received. A new tour operator we live in New Canaan was giving tours of the homes of AIG executives in Fairfield County. So it was, you know, like, you know, these are the lynch mobs who want to get the overly compensated financial services executives. All I can speak about is my own experience in working for one financial services firm for 28 years. We have a brutal compensation system. As a result of the trading losses that Morgan Stanley took in late 2008, all of the traders who were involved in those positions have been fired. All of their supervisors and managers have been replaced or asked to resign. The stockholders for all the securities and all the employees have the bulk of their net worth in the shares, most of whom are not involved in the activities. Their net worth is down an average of about 50% in terms of their cash holdings. And their optioned holdings, which account for about another third to 40% of their net worth, are worthless. I'm not saying that you should weep for Wall Street, but the idea that there's no accountability on compensation for making trading mistakes, banking mistakes, or other mistakes, and that could be addressed by having some type of clawback or other new compensation caps or procedures, I think is questionable. And I think the mistakes that our trading desk made, and they were made by a few rather than a lot, unfortunately would have been made under almost any compensation structure that I have seen proposed. So I think this is one of these populist, politically charged fixes that that has an awful lot of support and appeal, but one that is not effective. But the point that I would like to close on is, again, Dodd-Frank, necessary but not sufficient, addressed mainly at the crisis that has occurred. It's not clear that it will be effective in addressing the next crisis, and there will be a next crisis until we get, I think, a new thinking and design for monetary policy in the United States. Thank you.
Well, before we open the floor for some questions, let me see if there is any comment from one of the presenters to another one of the presenters. Tom?
Yeah. I just wanted to say something. Is this on? Yeah. About, since all three of us raised the issue of compensation, I want to say something about that. I think, you know, it's not true that compensation had no role in the financial crisis. I don't think it was necessarily central to it, but it certainly played a role in building up systemic risk on the balance sheet of these banks. And the best demonstration of that was at UBS. And UBS commissioned a study, I think it was done by McKinsey, but they hired some consultants to say, you know, how did we end up with all this garbage on our balance sheet? And the study gives a very clear account of how the compensation incentives of traders and people on trading desks gave them big rewards for basically operating this internal carry trade. Their cost of funds was low. They could buy these mortgage-related securities that produced a yield, put them on the books, warehouse them, and treat the interest differential as profit, which we all know it's not, or, you know, not in some real sense, but then add that to the pool on which their compensation was based. The other thing I want to say, so it definitely was a culprit. Was it a major culprit? I don't know. I'm not so sure. But Bob Shiller's analysis was exactly right, but it didn't go far enough. So what he said is that we need to reform compensation because even though shareholders and executives' interests are aligned, such that executives are rewarded for taking bigger risks because they know and the shareholders know that there is this implicit guarantee out there that they'll be rescued. They're too big to fail. There's a too big to fail insurance guarantee that kicks in. And so that pushes them in the direction, you know, they have lower costs of capital, pushes them to take greater risks. But the solution to that, part of the solution may be to have clawbacks and things like that. But the real solution to that is to price those guarantees. You have to price the insurance guarantees that are out there in the economy. You have to price too big to fail guarantees. You have to price access to lender of last resort.
What do you mean price them?
Charge you know, the FDIC, in its original conception, was an insurance company. You paid a price based on your riskiness. So, so something like that. I think it can be measured and it can be priced, but we're too afraid to do that.
Yeah, I should just recall that in reference to this incident at Jackson Hole, where Raul Rayan was vilified by somebody. I mean, precisely the point that Raul was making in that paper is that there were perverse or wrong incentives in the compensation structure of financial institution, and I think, at least in the context that he described, that he was right. On the other hand, is the point that Steve was mentioning, you know, and the story that Raghu said that, you know, these people are having are making a one-side bet in which they cannot lose and they can win a lot. Well, proved wrong, because the Lehman Brothers guys got their network totally wiped out. I think it was Asharia from your school who said they were like, you know, not only throwing bombs to a crowd, but they ran towards the crowd because they invested their own money in the garbage that they were originating and securitizing.
Can I just say something about
Yes.
Steve's comment that the Fed should be hardwired to worry about systemic issues? My first thought was that's already in the bill, because the Fed is a member of the Financial Services Oversight Council, which is defined as having a systemic objective. And the Treasury, the way the FSOC works, is to then delegate authority to the Fed for these firms that are grave risks to the economy to regulate. But I think you're right that this doesn't quite do it. Creating a meeting, I don't know how often they'll meet, once a month, all these heads of the Fed and the Treasury and the FDIC will get together in some meeting. That's not the same thing as having the Fed have its mission redefined as having the authority and responsibility for dealing with systemic crises. And I think that someone has to be responsible and has it as the main mission. So, and also the central bank is the logical. We have a tradition of almost 100 years, and other countries even longer, for the central bank having maybe some responsibility for systemic risks. And so it seems to me more natural. It would have been more natural to do what you said than what the Dodd-Frank bill said.
Let me just clarify one point. I think the Fed, yes, is a member. Initially, of course, they wanted to run this committee, and they lost that battle. But they're now part of a process that presumably will deal with systemic risk in the narrow sense, the way you defined it, or maybe the way Tom defined it, the interrelationships between one institution and others. What I'm after is something that is actually broader than that, and that is that the basic monetary policy tool of the Fed, the overnight lending rate, be set in a way that is much more aligned with broad financial stability objectives in the United States. I mean, I remember you were kind enough to send me galley proofs of the first edition of your book, Irrational Exuberance, if my memory's correct, and published, you know, a few days before the NASDAQ bubble burst in March of 2000. And then you sent me proofs of the second edition that added in a chapter on the property bubble, as that one was beginning to burst as well. What I'm suggesting is that the Fed become a different organization, so you don't have to keep writing more editions of this book, updating another chapter, another bubble that the central bank has missed. I know that would sort of cost you in terms of your royalties, but in terms of your deeper interest in trying to have a stable and more secure crisis-free environment, I think that would go a long way.
It's the treasury bond bubble next, right?
That's happening right now. Yeah.
Okay, let's have some questions or comments from the audience. And let me start here. Okay. Get the microphone. I think it's on.
It's on? Okay. I'm Michael Casey from the Wall Street Journal. Bob was the only one that mentioned the Basel Committee, and I think it's interesting given that this is the Center for Study of Globalization that's sponsoring this, because Basel, of course, deals with a global solution to the regulatory situation. So I'd like to hear the panelists maybe sort of comment perhaps on the proposal that was released over the weekend, and the fact that we've got until effectively 2023 for all of the implementation to come through and get the right capital rules in place. That seems to me an enormous period of time within which we could have countless more crises. And in the context of that, I'd also like to sort of address, if you could address Steve's point about the Fed, because it seems to me that if you had very strong capital rules and you had leverage ratios and you dealt with the systemic problems through the regulatory framework, then the Fed could actually get away from the business of having to worry about the financial sector and focus on the economy. And it seems to me that that would be another way of addressing that. So I'd just like to, anybody who'd like to comment on that and sort of specifically talk about perhaps the Basel proposal. Thank you.
Well, the Basel Committee looked at a lot of studies about how to make the system more resilient. And what I've seen emphasized in the press reports I've read about it is that they're going to add what they call a capital conservation buffer to the capital stock requirements for banks. And so the problem is with capital requirements is that they start being violated in bad times. And so asking banks to rebuild their capital in a bad time is exactly backwards. So that's why you need a buffer. And the buffer, when you're violating the buffer, then your activities become limited. So it's a good idea. And then on top of that, they've added another counter-cyclical buffer that regulators can add at a time when the economy is overheated. And with the second buffer, that again requires banks to raise more capital in good times when it's imposed. So these are clever ideas. Now, there's other ideas that I belong to the Squam Lake group, and we were talking about contingent capital requirements. And I know that people at the Financial Stability Board, also in Basel, were studying these, but I haven't seen that these were recommended at this time. It's also in Dodd-Frank. Again, in the usual Dodd-Frank way, a study will be commissioned of contingent capital requirements, and then the appropriate regulators will have the power to impose them, something like that. So I think some good ideas still haven't been adopted. It seems like we're going part way, and Basel III is an improvement, but there are still more ideas that will help. But this is exactly the kind of systemic thinking that you were saying, that it is true that the bill kind of focuses on individual banks. And it doesn't say much about looking at the aggregate leverage ratio. Maybe John Giannakopoulos would have something to say about that. It says something, again, banks that have a grave threat to the economy might have a leverage ratio managed differently by regulators. It's not an inspirational proposal in that form, but maybe it will evolve into something. And there's still hearings, there's going to be more development of these ideas.
I think that I was trying to puzzle on Monday why European bank stocks went up. Because if Basel III were really binding on these folks, you would expect the rate of return on equity is going to fall. Credit's going to be tighter. But then you look at the time horizon, and I think it reflected a great sigh of relief that it wasn't going to bite anytime soon. One of the things I worry about is that these kind of global accords about capital requirements are a good idea in principle, but our past experience with them, if you take Basel II, it's just a miserable failure. Indeed, you could even argue that it played a big role in the financial crisis. And if there's a long time before these capital requirements have some bite, then there's a long time to engage in regulatory arbitrage. And what happened with Basel II is exactly that. So they still focus on one firm at a time, that one firm at a time has enough capital, and they still use risk weighting of assets to some degree, a little more strict than in the past. But it doesn't seem like the ultimate solution. Now, in the Dodd-Frank Act, what they said about capital requirements was that they were going to put in more stringent capital requirements, and that they would treat whatever the Basel III process came up with as a possible lower bound for what capital requirements could be. So they were fully aware of all the problems and politically and in terms of lobbying and pressure that the Basel process has inherently in it. And they said we're going to be tougher than that, most likely. So.
Okay.
It seems to me that if you want to have management and boards on the same
Go
side.
closer the microphone to.
If you want to have management and boards on the same side as the regulators, there has to be some incentive other than clawback and monetary considerations. What do you think about the possibility of jail time? I mean, the fear.
Jail time.
Not that anybody wants to see it happen, but that's the only fear that will put them on the same side.
If you break the law, you should go to jail.
Yeah.
So, set a law that, makes it a criminal offense to get your institution, involved in some type of systemic accident. And if that law is judged to be constitutional and survives the courts, and I'm not a legal expert, and then someone is guilty of that high crime, then off they go.
You better define it better than that.
No, but I think in the bill there is a provision which is much stronger than any previous provision, establishing the responsibility and the liability of directors of financial institutions beyond what is already stated in the statutes of the SEC. Whether that will make directors to be more serious about their job, I don't know.
But
I hope that's the case.
but in the bill, if you read that part carefully, sadly, I don't have a life. I read that part of the bill carefully. There's a lot of talk about rules of construction, and what the rules of construction say very clearly is that, there's been this law and rule in the U.S. that has kept, it's a rule that solves the problem of time consistency. It says if directors make decisions that are based on their best business judgment, even though they turn out to be lousy, you can't penalize them for it. You can't sue them. You can't send them to jail, and that's still going to be the rule that governs corporate directors.
That's the Delaware.
Yeah, it's
But
Delaware
Sarbanes
courts.
Oxley, if a CEO signs off on a quarterly earnings statement, and it is found that the CEO willingly was aware of something that was to be disclosed later, he is criminally liable. So
Yeah.
that's the closest
Yeah,
you can get to that. But I think it's very hard to create sort of a criminal code for violation of systemic risk standards that has yet to be written. And I think that's, you know, the job that Bob said he would be willing to take as the director of the Systemic Risk Research Council. When you design these metrics, and maybe they can be codified and there can be penalties for violating the codes. But there's nothing on the books right now that would make that a workable suggestion.
No, the blue shirt. Sorry.
Very much. I'm thinking of two aphorisms, two sayings. I mean, some men steal with a gun and some steal with a pen. And it seems, well, I'll just use that one. It seems to me that, and I have a 30-year career in corporate finance, and I'm lucky now to have been able to retire and come to Yale, where I finished a degree here. I think I know where I speak, whereof I speak when I say that you can make these rules and laws as complex as you want about behavior, and the fact is that these are very smart people who will find a way to get around whatever regulation, however meticulously crafted, may come to exist when these various studies have been completed and additional rules are written. So let us not look to, in my opinion, the capitalists to make this better. Let us instead look to the regulators. We've had wonderful regulators over the decades that I can think of. Volcker, I think Arthur Burns, going way back, had my admiration. Arthur Levitt at the SEC. These were men of probity who knew it was a game, and they had to put their full weight into it in order to push against the capitalists who were finding clever ways around the rules. And when we joke, I think quite reasonably, about men like Snow or O'Neill, who were doing comically irrelevant things at the time, you really have to say the regulators have failed. So I guess I would ask, I guess my question is, would you comment? Don't you think it's the regulators and their intention that matters most at the end of the day? If they take the laws, if they take the rules seriously and fight like hell, they can keep the games to a minimum. I won't say, oh, keep them from happening, but keep them to a minimum. Would you care to comment?
I'll comment on that, just briefly. Somebody asked me this question at a conference that I don't remember exactly. It had something to do with central banks, and I said, look, you work in a central bank, or you worked in the Federal Reserve Board in this case. Who are the soup reg guys? Who are the soup reg crew at the Board of Governors? And how much are they paid compared to the monetary economists? Where are their offices? You know, do you know any of them by name? It's a matter of giving people in executing regulatory functions some level of reward and some status for doing that responsibly. You know, otherwise it just becomes a bureaucratic function. So I guess I agree with you.
No,
Thanks. I actually had a question that was sort of the opposite of the last question. And I was wondering how much we can reasonably expect legislation to mitigate these systemic risks. And especially given that, I guess I was wondering how much exactly is risk an endemic part of financial markets? And so how could we possibly conceive of reforming the financial system in such a way that reduces the possibilities of a subsequent downturn especially when we consider things in the long run, and also look at sort of a global picture about how financial markets are increasingly intertwined and whether legislation in the US really has the ability to impact sort of global systemic issues.
I would just say that risk is not, systemic risk is not an intrinsic risk. It depends on the design of the system. And that in the 19th century, we had periodic banking crises that involved the compromise of the money. Your money became worthless, you care. Then we had, we got the national banking system, which helped reduce that. And then we got the Federal Reserve system, which helped reduce that problem. So we made progress. But still, in 1933, your bank saving account was vulnerable, and lots of innocent people lost everything because they had it in the bank. Well, they weren't insured. And so then we got deposit insurance. Now, these examples of progress, that we have to keep fixing the system as it gets more advanced. Like the shadow banking system appeared. But I don't think that the unregulated system is going to work well. It's our ability to minimize systemic risk is a sign of our progress, and it's something that we have to keep doing.
Okay, last question, unfortunately. Let me go all the way back. You. Yeah.
I'd like to ask Professor Shiller, in light of what Mr. Roach said, what he sees as the mandate, like what the new mission for the Fed, or what the mission should include in terms of financial stability, directly referring to the policy and what has gone on. And you mentioned yourself just now the 19th century banking, or the bank crises. It would just seem to me, especially if we again look at Mr. Roach's career, the emphasis on Asia, there's a lot of problems. The Dodd-Frank Act, or the act that is, again, it is sort of looking back. It may or may not address what's going forward, but it seems the real crux of the problem is the liquidity. There's just so much out there, and there remains to be so much out there. We look at Japan, the talk of the carry trade that was once the huge yen carry trade. If you could just comment on your thoughts of perhaps there's a real solution with having the Fed sort of curtailing the Fed's powers, and/or really saying the Fed's mandate must include some restraints in terms of how much control they have over the monetary policy, the use of, the policy.
Well, I think that it's implicit in things that others have said here, that a liquidity cycle, maybe we should have John G. answer this question. We have a liquidity cycle, and it hasn't been recognized, and it doesn't seem to be fully understood by the framers of this bill. And so we need regulators who are, now we do in some sense have it. I mean, Basel III is involved with, it is a step forward, but maybe John, can we ask you to give your,
Yeah, John.
your, how would you answer this question? This is John Giannakopoulos in the econ department here at Yale.
Well, I would like to make a comment that has a little bit to do with the question, and also it connects things everybody said. I think the idea that the failure, if there is a failure in the Dodd-Frank bill, is that it concentrates too much on institutions and too little on the systemic economy. That's what Tom Cooley said. I think that's a very central point. And it's connected to the idea of what Steve said, that there should be that bubbles played a very big role in the current crisis and have in previous crises. And maybe we should add, and this is maybe connected to your question, maybe we should expand the powers of the Fed to look after bubbles as well as their other two missions of inflation and unemployment. My reaction to all that is that I agree with almost all of that, except I think one has to add one more thought, that monetary policy is just one thing. Regulating the amount of money or the interest rate is just one tool. And we've been confined for some reason to this one tool for far too long. So I think I would disagree with Steve when he says that it was the low interest rates that caused our crisis and that we could have avoided it all with better interest rates. Many people say that. I just heard at Jackson Hole, in fact, Taylor of the Taylor Rule, he said, the only thing that went wrong, we said, we followed the Taylor Rule up to the second decimal place until a few years ago, and then we got away from it. That's his rule. And now look what happened to our economy. And all we have to do is go back to the Taylor Rule. So Steve is saying something a little bit similar to that, and I think it falls far short of what we need to do. There's another variable. When you make a loan, almost all loans, the vast majority of loans are collateralized. When you borrow money to buy a house, they can take your house if you don't pay back. So the amount of money as a fraction, the loan to value is a fraction of the house. That's a second variable besides the interest rate. It's a far more important variable. So what caused bubbles, I think, is that too high loan to value. If we didn't have such a high loan to value, we wouldn't have had the bubbles. We could have played around with the interest rate. I don't think that would have stopped the bubbles. It certainly didn't reverse the bubbles. When we got into the crisis, we set the interest rate at 0, and it didn't solve our problems. If you can't get things to go back up by lowering the interest rate, I don't think that the changing the interest rate is that one tool can't do everything. So in summary, I think that I agree that the Fed, my own view, that the Fed or this council that Bob talked about so much, somebody should have the responsibility of regulating systemic risks. I think part of that has to be looking at leverage, loan to values, what I mean by that. Part of that has to be connected to looking at loan to values, something that we've just avoided doing for far too long, even though anyone at Morgan Stanley would tell you that loan to value is a critical variable, and yet we just ignore it. And we shouldn't do that. And I think, and now this Office of Financial Research, they have the power to investigate and to uncover what all the loan to values are. How much do people put down on houses? How about to buy an inverse IO? And they could study that, study that comprehensively and reveal the numbers. So, sorry, I've talked a little bit too long, but the bottom line is, I think that we have another variable, which is leverage, and that if the Fed were to use that, it could stabilize the economy. And these measures that have been passed in Basel III and the Dodd-Frank bill, which basically says, look at an institution and sort of look at their debt to equity ratio, that's kind of like leverage, that's going to be a complete failure, because if you limit the debt to equity ratios of a few banks or other financial institutions, the leverage will just move somewhere else. And if you limit the overall debt to equity ratio of one big institution, they'll just hold riskier securities where they don't need to leverage as much. So in fact, you'll force them to do even worse. Yeah. So I think the solution to our problem has to lie in looking, as Tom said, at economy-wide problems and not institution-bound problems. So measuring leverage at the level of what's the loan-to-value of particular things you're borrowing against. And once you recognize that as a key variable and allow the Fed or some other regulatory body to manage that as well, I think we can make tremendous problems. I don't think the next crisis is going to be completely different from the previous ones. It's going to involve leverage even the next time.
Thank you, John. I think you are saying that there is still some hope for macroeconomists who have been disgraced, but we still have probably some work to do. Unfortunately, time is over, so all what remains is to say thank you to our three great panelists, and thank you to you for attending.